Hello, folks. Great to be with you. My name is Jose Ramos, and I am Director of Action Foresight and Futures Lab. It's a pleasure to be presenting on systems thinking and systems strategies. This presentation is really quite a just very eclectic mix of different systems thinking. It's both about systems sort of thinking and analysis, but also about thinking about political systems and strategic interventions. So with that, I'll just jump straight in. Just really happy for people to take out what they find useful. The first, I think, important point is that we sort of have merged into a systems-based perspective or thinking over the last 30 to 40 years. Most of the 20th century had a very reductionist emphasis on understanding how the world works. And the reductionist or mechanistic view focuses on the parts. It's about linear causality. A causes B. And the observer is always objective. You know, I can stand apart from the system. Context is, you just eliminate the context, just messy stuff. Look for a truth and externalities. What comes out of that system are not important. And it's about solving problems. And then over the last, really it's a half century, but more quickening over the last 30 years. The systems view sees the interconnections between things. The emergence of transdisciplinarity and the work of Donella Meadows in understanding systems and understanding our whole Earth as a living system. The Gaia hypothesis is a kind of systems theory. So much of our new, quote unquote, new understanding is really based on seeing the interconnections between things. And of course, a lot of indigenous people have been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. So this is not new, and this is not something that, somehow the Western science invented. Absolutely not. But it's something which, in a sense, has become a kind of parallel stream where maybe you might say that the Western science or science in general is catching up with indigenous thinking in this regard. So systems approach focuses on wholes, sees circular causality. A can cause B, B can cause C. That can go feedback into A. So that's the idea of positive feedback loops. The observer's status is subjective. We see particular systems, but those are not the systems. They're how we create a boundary around a system. Context is highly relevant because every context is going to influence the subcontext of the system. There are multiple truths and answers because you can look at systems from different perspectives and get different answers. Externalities are important. What happens within a system and how it influences the system next to it, for example. And then problems are not necessarily solved, but they're dissolved. They're understood better. So that gives you a sense of, kind of the broad, kind of brush strokes around the kind of new thinking that's emerged over the past half century and more recently. In terms of analytic perspectives, the ones I'm going to quickly cover are panarchy, soft systems, systems dynamics, three horizons of change, and viable systems model. I'm not necessarily talking about them in the order in which they've emerged historically. Some of these are very recent, some of them are older. They're just, you can do your research and find the historical kind of starting point, but they're all just, different perspectives that help us to think about what a system is. The panarchy perspective is really, really useful, very well developed, foundational text by, I think, Lance Gunderson and Buzz Hollings. The Resilience Alliance here uses this kind of thinking. And the basic idea is that that and they really got to start looking at natural systems, looking at, for example, the Florida wetlands, different ecosystems around the United States, North America, and then the people here looking at Australian bioregions. So this is kind of came from a kind of living systems perspective, but has wider applications and is being used in different social and socio-political contexts as well. The basic idea is that systems go through 4 phases. Phases are roughly conservation. So a system will be in a state in which it's well established, and if you think about like a forest, the species are well established, and if you're a new species trying to get a kind of foothold into that ecosystem, it's going to be a little different. But over time, an ecosystem becomes brittle. Its potential goes up. It's meaning the energy within the system, but its resilience kind of goes down. Its connectedness goes up, and it makes it much harder for new entrants to get a foothold. But the system as a whole doesn't. It has less and less, in a sense, capacity to deal with dramatic changes. And you can think of forests that have not been properly managed, that are subject to that haven't had a regular sort of fire treatment. A lot of undergrowth has built up, and then you have the right conditions, and all of a sudden the whole thing explodes. You have a massive forest fire. Instead of having a localized forest fire, you have one that takes out, like what we saw with the Australian fires. And then you have a release phase, and that release phase is that release of energy. And then when you come, and that release of energy is a fairly quick phase. The conservation phase is very slow. The release phase is very fast. And then you have a reorganization phase. So the forest is burnt. Whatever wildlife survived is still, is there. And you have a reorganization phase, a time when a new pattern is being established. And then an exploitation phase is really the phase in which, those species that are left there have an opportunity to establish themselves. And the ones that establish themselves are able to become, in a sense, the template for the future system. So you can see the kind of overlaps with, political, economic thinking when we've seen systems like, for example, the Soviet Union break down, and you had this, in a sense, of release phase, and the reorganization. Unfortunately, there was, mafia and oligarchs took over, and you basically got this kind of extreme oligarchic state, and you merge into the new kind of Putin-led, cabal. They also see systems as systems within systems. So you got that subsystems, see on the right there. There's just a lot of nuance in their work. There's a lot of publications in the panarchy area. It's well worth it, in terms of being able to think strategically and critically about how different systems might be changing. The next approach that I want to cover is just Peter Checklin. Peter Checklin developed soft systems methodology, which is an approach to systems thinking, which basically says you can define a system the way that you can put a boundary around any particular system that you want to examine and understand how that system works. So it's a way of basically breaking down a particular domain of activity. This could be anything from, a department within an organization, like a university or a company or a government, and say, I want to understand how this department works as a system. You can look at it from the point of view of a particular kind of market. So it can be applied really to anything. It's a very adaptable, flexible approach, and essentially creating sort of abstracted elements that help you to think about how a system works. You have a problem situation. You express that problem situation. You get a root definition of the purposeful activity of the system. You build a conceptual model of the system. And you sort of try to compare the world and the model. Okay, well, this is the model that we have of that system. And what do we see the world? And so there's this kind of going back and forth, I guess, between what the world looks like and what the system's thinking is in the background. You're also looking for changes, systemically desirable and culturally feasible changes. So you're thinking, what can I influence here? And building actions to improve the problem situation. So soft systems methodology kind of overlaps a little bit with action research. Robert Flood is well known for his combination of systems thinking, soft systems thinking, and action research. Danny Burns and other people have really been able to combine systems thinking and action research well. Now, another very important line is systems dynamics. Systems dynamics is an earlier branch of systems thinking that goes back to the 1970s. I think it was Jay Forrester who did one of the first MIT studies on transport systems, showing that the more roads are built, the worse traffic gets. Up until that time, people thought build roads and you alleviate traffic, and and his modeling showed no, if you build more roads, people buy more cars and you have more traffic. And so you get these kinds of outcomes with systems modeling. You get counterintuitive understandings. The limits to growth study that Danella Meadows and colleagues did back in '72 was a systems dynamic study, but of a very complex and kind of grand scale, looking at whole world systems, population, economic growth, et cetera, et cetera. Importantly, she did say by the 2040s, 2050s, that the trajectory of our economic system doesn't change, we're going to be in a massive, crisis. And she's pretty much on track. So systems dynamics, and she also modeled alternative systems. Okay, well, what if population goes down? What if economic growth goes down? What if this factor? So systems dynamics allow you to take real world elements. They do have to be quantifiable. Systems dynamics is a quantitative approach to systems work, and so you're crunching numbers, you're making number-based assumptions, you're building essentially a mathematical model about how the world changes. Can be applied to many things, stocks and flows, population, logistics. And one of the best softwares to use is called Vensim, which is very, very kind of one of the most straightforward systems dynamics models that you can apply. Another important systems-based model is called the Viable Systems Model by Stafford Beer. He was a cyberneticist of the 70s and 80s and after. And he created a model by which he believed any organism conforms to. This could be a human, it could be an animal, it could be a cultural body, like it could be an organization, a government organization, or a company, or even a larger thing like a university. And the basic idea is that any entity has 5 subsystems: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Level 5 of the system is the identity of the system. It's how the system sees itself and its own purpose. So some might say, Jose as an entity believes he's a human, and he has an identity as a Mexican, and also as a US citizen, and he believes he's male, and he sees himself as a researcher, et cetera, et cetera. Identity is a pretty strong aspect of the system. So imagine if I said, like I really don't feel like a male, and my life is to be an artist. Well, that identity would be quite different. Okay, well, I now identify as a woman, and I'm not a researcher. I'm an artist. I'm a female art. You're right. So you can see how identity is pretty fundamental to any entity. And if you look at organizations, the sense of mission and purpose is pretty baked in. And one of the things that would really in any system would be the hardest thing to change. Now, the system 4 is the intelligence of the system, and that's a system that's able to look out at the world, at the environment, and see, okay, what's happening there? What's changing? As I walk down the road, I got to cross the street, and my eyes have to look both ways on the road, make sure no cars are coming. I don't want to get hit, right? So that's that part of the system that's like, okay, what's happening here? And I want to be able to understand the future a little bit. Oh, okay, things are going to change a little. Oh, okay, well, I've been an academic for 10 years, but it looks like my university is going to close down my department. There's a bit of intelligence there, right? Thinking about the future. Or if you're an encyclopedia company in the 1990s, we hope that they looked at changes in the internet and saw how Wikipedia was going to completely disrupt their industry. So the intelligence of an organization is able to look out into the world, see changes, and think about the future. And you can see that if that part of a system doesn't feed back into the system 5 identity, then you're in trouble. Identity is going to be static. It's going to stay the same, even while the world is changing. So it's going to run off a cliff in a sense. The third part of that system is the control part. That's bringing together the identity and the intelligence, and also working with system 2, which is a coordination function. Okay, well, we need to do things in the world. How do we do it? Well, let's move the right leg forward and the left leg, the right leg and then the left leg. Okay, we want to build something. Okay, we want to have chickens in the back of our house. Okay, we need to build a chicken coop. Okay, how do I coordinate that? I'm going to call the hardware store, see if they have the right things that I need, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see all these different elements have to come together within any entity. And then all those kind of system 1s are actually working in the world. They're engaged with the world. So they also have this kind of engagement, but they don't have a higher level intelligence function. They have a very basic, you might call it visceral experience of the world. So in a company might be the difference between, let's say in a software company, it's the difference between people building the software and the marketers selling the software and getting feedback from customers. That's system 1. Whereas the people in the company who are looking at products, thinking about products for the next 5 years, that's system 4. They're quite different in the way that they engage with the world. And the point around this is both analytic. You can analyze a system using this approach. That's very useful between the meta system and the operating system. But you can also enhance the operation of a particular entity. In cybernetics, they talked about how information moved between one part of a system to another part of the system. And so how do you enhance information? And also, how do you enhance decision-making? Stafford Beer didn't see this as a hierarchical model. He wanted participation within an organization. And so he wanted each part of that organization to have a voice, people in that organization have a voice and be able to communicate, be listened to, and listen to others. So that's the cybernetics aspect of it, is how do you enhance that kind of movement between these different elements in an organization. Okay, another systems model is Three Horizons of Change, developed by Andrew Curry, Tony Hodgson, and Bill Sharp. And this is a futures-oriented systems model. And basically, you have three horizons in this model. Horizon 1 is the present. Horizon 3 is the imagined future. And Horizon 2 is this kind of transition space. And this is a mapping modeling approach, which is incredibly useful. I use it a lot in my own work. And what it allows you to do is see, if you look at the H1 line, it allows you to see what you assume, what you think is the dominant system, but the system that'll become less viable over time. So if you see time going from left to right, that line is going down. So that assumption is, okay, it's becoming less viable over time. But like fossil fuels, you might say it was dominant 10 years ago, but now it's well and truly in decline. And we know that we have to essentially sequester most of the fossil fuels on the planet to ensure safe climate. So, we can even make these, pretty strong assumptions about how particular existing systems will become less and less viable over time, from left to right. At the same time, you have H3, which is an alternative system. And that could be, in the context of renewable energy, solar and wind, and if you went back 20 years ago, that line would be very low. But now that line's, it's rising pretty fast. And so you can see a new system kind of, in a sense, taking over from the old system. And then Horizon 2 really is that transition space. And that's that space of contestation. People don't necessarily want to lose their power. There's vested interests. There's media gambits. There's, there's trigger events. There's a whole number of things that happen there. It takes a lot of strategic thinking to look for the leverage points that you can target within that Horizon 2 space. So here, we talked about, okay, well, if we think that neoliberal capitalism is in decline, what is the alternative system? We think sustainable, commons-oriented, tech-led abundance. Okay, we can make a bunch of assumptions about what Horizon 3 would be. This is just for, kind of demonstration. Okay, well, what is Horizon 2 then? How do we get there? What's the transition space? How do we work against the vested interests of neoliberal capitalism? And at the same time, how do we support the forms that we want to see grow? So it's a very good mapping modeling approach for strategic thinking. Very highly recommend. So at a broader level, more at the level of a principle, Archimedes was supposedly said that, give me a place to stand with a lever and I will move the earth. And that's that idea of the leverage point. And we all know that, the further out we are on the lever, the more force we can exert, which is, one of these kind of principles of mechanics, classic principles of mechanics. Donella Meadows wrote, you might say, the foundational kind of overview of this principle, which is where are the biggest leverage points to look. And interestingly, she started with, she starts her paper really at number 8 and goes to number 1, with parameters, and then regulating positive and negative feedback loops, resource flows, information flows. We've seen all of this with these different models that I've been presenting: information flows, cybernetics, rules of the system, incentivizing this and disincentivizing something else. Distribution of power over rules, systems goals, that's a purpose system, like in VSM, viable systems model, system 5, change the goal, change the identity, change the purpose. But the number one thing she said was mindset. She said, this is the biggest leverage point and the hardest leverage point to change. It's mindset, it's the paradigm, it's the epistemology, it's the discourse, it's the way that people see the world, the language within which they see the world. And this is a very, very powerful statement to make about systems and about how, how we change what we change. Her article on that is well worth reading, and it's widely available on the internet. Okay, I'm going to quickly go into some action perspectives. In the area of action research, Danny Burns, I mentioned him. I mentioned Robert Flood. Yolan Wadsworth's work has been the most influential for me in terms of the combination of systems thinking and action research. And collective impact, I think, is another important approach. Yolan Wadsworth, the way that she sees cycles within an action research approach is between plan, act, observe, reflect. There is no beginning point or end point in a cycle like this. So, for example, if we observe a situation and we reflect on it and try to make sense of it, that might bring us to some ideas about how to change it. So we plan those changes, and then we act it out. We actually, we try something. It could be an experiment. It could be some intervention. And then there was something that happened when we did that. And there's the observation bit again. Okay, what actually happened when we did that? Okay, let's reflect more. Let's get a deeper understanding. Let's come to a new plan. So the essence of the action research cycle is the engagement with the world, but not just the engagement, but the ability to step back and think critically about what's happening in a particular place, and come up with new ideas. It's a very empowered, proactive approach to how it's not a disinterested view of a system, but let's engage in a system, let's be part of that system, and let's transform that system. Here's a photo of Muhammad Yunus with some Bangladeshi rural village women. He was given the Nobel Prize for his work creating the micro-lending in that context. And people don't widely know that actually that came from an action research project. It came from a lot of experimentation, a lot of trial and error. And initially, when he was working with the rural villagers, realized that a little bit of capital would go a long way to help them to invest in the things that they needed. He was literally lending money out of his own pocket. And over time, formalized what worked in that system. Okay, it works for the villagers to work together. It works for it only to be women, so they're not influenced by the other interests that men have. It works for them to do a kind of group accounting over time. There's a whole number of principles, and those are things that can be very hard to work out. You're not going to have that model up front. You're going to have to go on a discovery process to get to that. So there's going to be many cycles that you engage in and that's what that left diagram kind of shows. There are many cycles that you engage in order to to do to create something new, to innovate something new. And so we often celebrate the outcome. Okay, well, this is micro lending. Oh, that's so genius. Blah blah blah. You know, and to be honest, a lot of micro lending, as soon as it gets faddish, that's a big red flag, because you know then you got other people going into this whole space that don't have the same ethics that you know Muhammad Yunus had, and can be quite exploitative. But people celebrate the outcome, micro lending. But what was the process that got you there? Well, it was this kind of systems-based action research approach that helped you to untangle a problem and address a problem and support solutions. And one of the points that Yolan Wadsworth makes is that no one person can do the whole action research learning cycle. It takes a team, and it takes a team that's actually cognitively and ability-wise quite diverse. Different personalities and inquiry preferences are stronger on some parts of a project cycle than others. And she correlated Myers-Briggs inquiry preferences with the project cycle. So she did quite an extensive mapping of, if you're a particular type on Myers-Briggs, where are you comfortable in this action research cycle? And she argued that strong teams need to have different people who are good at different parts of the project cycle, working well together. And people who can appreciate and hold a space for holistic inquiry. Someone has to think, okay, well, we need a team that can do many different things. When we think from the point of view of the viable systems model, well, the viable systems model we talked about, if we can just go back to that, just so, because I think these correlations are quite important. You know, we had identity at 5. This is the high level purpose. This is who I am. Intelligence, how's the world changing? Control, how do we bring this all together? Coordination, and then the actual actions, the operations. So if we think in those terms, and we look back here, well, when you're in the observe and reflect space, that's very much that systems 4, right? You're looking at an experience, you're experiencing the world, and you're analyzing the world. When you're in the reflect the plan, you're very much a kind of consolidating the purpose. Okay, well, we need to come up with a plan, and this is what we should be doing. And then from plan to action is really translating purpose into strategy and operations. This is what we want to do, and this is the best way forward, and these are our operations. And so we're going to act in this particular way. And VSM system 1 to 2 is really operation, coordination, evaluation. How do those micro actions work? You know, observing the small cycle. And this is what Yolan says, is that most organizations, most people will be in the operational loop. How can we improve existing systems? They've been told, do these particular actions, get these particular results, see what happens, and improve that. And so in an organization, a lot of people will simply not have a whole lot of understanding or respect for people who are thinking at a more abstract level, are putting together dots between many different things. And so that strategic loop, how can we change existing systems? You know, it's not about improving, it's about changing. And these are kind of disruptive people. And oftentimes are the people that, you know, they see a bigger picture, but they feel a little bit like Cassandra, you know, no one's listening to them. You know, why aren't people listening to me? I see how the system, you know, continued growth is running us off a cliff. Why isn't anyone listening to me? Well, because people are in the operational loop. They're trying to improve the system. They're not questioning the whole purpose of the system. And, you know, tension, if different types can't appreciate each other. Okay, yeah, we do need the operational loop. We also need a strategic loop. How do we bring those together? And the adaptive organizations, when there's crossover. Okay, you have the strategic people saying, we actually need some fundamental changes. And you got the operation people going, okay, yeah, we can accept that. Let's keep our core operational systems, but get rid of the ones that are harmful. And let's work with, so really, this is what she's basically saying. The heart of what she's saying is, in any organization or in teams, people have different inquiry preferences. They're going to be stronger in different parts of this. How do we have broader appreciation and allow people to work together for the betterment of the systems involved? Okay, just a few more elements to go. So collective impact is another approach, really foundational, really strong. This one comes from the basic concept that a single organization cannot tackle a wicked problem. Wicked problems are multi-systemic, multi-definitional. They're changing, they're evolving. You might think of, let's say, poverty in Los Angeles, right? You have different communities in the Los Angeles area. We might even think in Australia, in Sydney, or in any Australian city. There's places where there's strong elements of poverty, or in some regional towns. It's going to be a wicked problem. It's not going to be one organization can't just go in with its cape and superpowers and solve it all. And there's a sense of vulnerability. Like, how do we solve this problem? How do we solve the issue of climate change? How do we solve the issue of youth justice, recidivism? These are very messy problems. So the idea of collective impact is you get many different organizations that have an interest, to have a stake in an issue, to work together as collaborators. And when I mean many organizations, like some of these collective impact projects will have dozens of organizations together. And so, they essentially develop a framework for how to work together. They develop an anchor institution that can bring people together. They create a common agenda. This is what we want to tackle. And these are multi-year projects to create change and to shift a system that is resistant to change, or where there's a lot of complexity, a lot of elements. Create a shared measurement system. How do we measure the changes that we want to make? Develop continuous communication between all those organizations. Create mutually reinforcing activities. This one's really interesting. The idea within collective impact is that the organizations don't all do the same thing, because different organizations have different capabilities. One might be a government, one might be a social enterprise, one might be something else. So they're going to, do reinforcing activities, not the same activities. And I think that's a really important point. And then they got to build the kind of anchor institutions or backbone support organizations that will keep the whole process running. Then, according to Collective Impact Australia, collective impact is a framework for facilitating and achieving large-scale social change. It's a structured and disciplined approach to bringing cross-sector organizations together to focus on a common agenda that results in long-lasting change. So that's kind of a bit of a summary there. Systemically power social interventions. And I've already covered those bits. Some social problems and challenges are complex and require nuanced collaboration that a single organization is not able to address alone. Okay, so now just to finish up, systems and power, C. Wright Mills, Scolaire, and Robinson. And this really is about political systems. When people talk about systems, they can be talking about a whole number of things. They can be talking about an organization as a system, as we've seen with the viable systems model. They can be talking about something they're just looking at with a bit of complexity, more like a soft system. They might be looking at a natural system, an ecosystem. So systems, there is no one definition of a system. There's many discourses and many concepts about what a system is. And arguably, an earlier definition of systems really had to do with social systems and political and economic systems. According to Leslie Scalaire and William Robinson, they really looked at the global system through the lens of economic, cultural, and political systems. And when they looked at the current global capitalist economy, in the economic sphere, they basically saw transnational corporations and their interests as the primary actors. And culturally, it's the culture ideology of consumerism, that we've created worth based on our possessions and accumulation. And so this has become the cultural template that we're given on a daily basis with advertisements and reinforced through our social interactions and the expectations that are made within those interactions. And politically, they talked about transnational capitalist class, plutocratic systems of governance. We've already talked about oligarchy. So this is how they see a global. They named their approach global systems theory, and they use that word systems to describe a global system. And you can see how that's very broad brushstrokes. They have, these are one of the foremost scholars on global political economy. So they have, very well developed sort of thinking around what that actually means. David Korten, who really was one of those people, one of the pioneers of thinking about, okay, well, let's create a post-corporate world. What does that look like? And the way that he sees a kind of post-corporate alternative globalization from an economic point of view of local living economies, localized economies, fair share taxation and trade, right? So, companies paying their fair share, and democratizing workplaces. How do we have more democracy within our workplaces? How do we create democratic forms? From a cultural point of view, post-patriarchy and the importance of feminine leadership, the narratives of an Earth community, that we're all part of a community of the Earth, and we work together, and that deeper kind of spiritual inquiry. So that's this kind of cultural template for an alternative globalization. And politically, it's democratizing structures of governance, participatory and open media, and precautionary policymaking. So you can see when we think, both from the point of view of Scalaire and Robinson's critique of, the world global system, and Korten's sort of imagination of an alternative system. Systems can mean thinking about the whole world and the elements within that. I use the economic, cultural, and political template to think about social change quite a lot. So, from a cultural view, if we're thinking about climate change as an issue, we can see that just from the point of view of, okay, well, no, the left one actually has to do with the aftermath of the 9/11 attack on the U.S. So in the aftermath of the attack on the U.S. by Al Qaeda, there was a climate of fear. So you might see from a cultural point of view, desire for retribution, but also manufactured conspiracy. So the leaders in the United States made up a bunch of baloney about, Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, and invaded Iraq, and that cost anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million lives. It was a crime. It was a crime that went unpunished. And of course, there are voices for no war, anti-war protests. Those were ignored. So you can see within any particular moment or situation, you have different elements manifesting. This is a cultural one. If you think economics, Now this has changed, but if we go back, 5 or 10 years, uh, the power of oil, gas, and coal companies is still strong. And then there's the relative economic power of renewable energy sectors. If we think about the broader globalization debate within politics, go back 15 years, and the neoliberal or Washington consensus policies very dominant. I think today they're not as dominant, especially post-Trump and what's happened with China and India. But then you had detractors. You had that alter globalization movement, the anti-globalization movement, Occupy, right? And so within political systems, I call this the fishbone model. And the fishbone looks a little bit like a fish, and it shows what's dominant and what's kind of not as dominant. And on the right, I think the most important kind of element here is that social, political, economic, cultural systems will find synergies to maintain and reproduce power. So, what Scalera is showing and Robinson's showing within the global system is a kind of reinforcing system of power between transnational corporations, capitalist class, and an ideology of consumerism. And so when we look at these three elements, culture, politics, and economics, there will be reinforcing elements. If we think particularly, if we go back in time and look in this through this lens of reciprocating power, John Howard worked within the political sphere, but he was influenced by what was then called, they call themselves the greenhouse mafia. These were this was the mineral lobby in Australia. And there was a reciprocation of values. The greenhouse mafia didn't want carbon taxes. They didn't want, they didn't want the Australian government to do anything about climate change. So they worked very hard to, in a sense, they used the Howard government for their own interests. And then, of course, the scientific community was locked out of the policy process during the Howard years. It sat there kind of alongside, but kind of as a neglected, kind of neglected child. We think about Kevin Rudd's resource rent super tax. This was during one of the mining booms. There's so many here in Australia, but Kevin Rudd proposed rent super tax. The mining companies launched a massive ad campaign that functionally destabilized his Labor government. That had influence on popular culture, and Rudd began to lose consent to govern in his own party. And the loss of consent to govern was based on a few other things as well, but that was part of it. If we think of Gillard's Green Left Alliance, she enacted a carbon tax. Of course, she had ceaseless attacks by the Murdoch media on her character and the Labor government. Of course, there was a lot of misogyny involved in that. You still had CSIRO. You had a poor perception of labor because of infighting. And then, from the grassroots, organizations like Beyond Zero Emissions already had a vision for zero carbon Australia. But of course, the mining companies still wanted to undermine that. And so those policies were ultimately watered down by Tony Abbott, or I think functionally destroyed. So you can see the interplay between the politics, economics, and culture. When we think systems, we can also think, okay, well, some people use the word political economy. Political economy doesn't include culture. You can't really exclude culture from thinking about, how an economy works or how a political system works. And this can be applied to many different things, to how oligarchs defend their wealth, creating the cult of the billionaire. The United States is a cult of the billionaire. And oligarchs will use their wealth to defend their wealth by influencing political systems. And also policies within politics that maintain money politics, that allow lobbying to happen. And you can think across scales, so you can have one scale within a larger scale, kind of like the systems, the subsystems. So we can think, we have a transnational system, and that's what Leslie Scalera and Bill Robinson described. And then you have subsystems, in the national space. So that's basically an overview of the different systems, ideas, and theories. You have, you have some that are more descriptive and analytical. You have some which are interventionist in a community base. And you have some that really describe, whole social systems and how they operate and function. So I hope that was a useful overview, and look forward to meeting you online and in person. And I hope you can find some elements here that have been useful. Thank you.